Hello and welcome to another tutorial. We are continuing on the discussion on the switch statement, and in the previous lecture we saw an example of the switch. We are switching on an int type, and we said that the body of a switch statement is known as a switch block, and you have to explicitly create a code block with a pair of curly braces. This semicolon is not necessary, so you don't need to put a switch after to put a semicolon after the body of a switch statement or switch block. A statement in the switch block can be labeled with one or more case or default labels, right? Remember, default is also a case, and each case has to have a test value, and the way switch works is that it checks, or basically it tests the value against the parameter or argument that we are switching over it, right? And we said default is a special case that it definitely executes, or basically if none of the other tests match, then we go into default. And we said that default can be anywhere in the switch. It doesn't have to be the last one, but then if you put it, for example, somewhere in between, you have to also add the break. Otherwise, if we execute the default, then the other tests will become invisible and fall through might happen. So we said that the behavior of the switch is a little bit weird in the case that if one of the cases match, or one of the tests basically succeeds, the other tests become invisible. They never get reevaluated. This is in opposite to, for example, having multiple if-else statements, right? So if, for example, this case 0 succeeds, its body will be evaluated, but then the rest of the case statements or the rest of the tests are invisible. It's like they're not there. So if I don't have a break and case 0, this test succeed, I execute that, and then I also execute the next one until basically we hit a break. Otherwise, we just fall through all of them, right? Now, I mean, this is typically not what you want. So most of the cases you add this break to all the cases. You can even configure your basically IDE's code analysis to make sure that it warns you if you forgot to add break. Default in this case doesn't need a break, but we said that if you don't put it as the last, then you have to add a break, otherwise fall through happens. And the switch statement evaluates its expression, which means this argument can be an expression that returns one of the allowed types. Then executes all statements that follow the matching case label. And once one of the tests succeeds, again, I'm going to repeat it again. If a test, the first test that succeeds, the rest become invisible. So you have to be careful. You may have noticed the use of the break keyword. Each break statement terminates the enclosing switch statement, and we basically jump completely out of the switch. Now you cannot use labels, so let's see if we can use a label here. For example, if I say here colon, remember for the loops we could use labels, and note that I'm not getting a basically compilation error, which very interestingly means we can actually use labels on the switch as well, because these are also part of the basically the control flow. And another reason is that you can in fact nest this switch into another switch or in a for loop statement, etc. So all the branchings, not just loops, even mainly for loops we use labels, but even for the switch, as you can see, compilation allowed in terms of adding label to the switch, right? And then the question is, can we break, but instead of breaking out of the switch, let's see if we can break to the label. And this is allowed, which is very interesting. So if I run this, let's set this to 0. Let's see what happens. So we get Q1. Now let's see what happens if we end up with case 1. We are breaking, but we are breaking to, instead of jumping out of the loop, or we say breaking out of the switch, we break back to the switch itself. So let's see what happens. Q2. So this really didn't have any effect, interestingly enough. So if we have 2 Q3 somewhere, right? So this break doesn't seem to have any real effect. This labeling, you can break out of the switch, you can break to the switch. It's equivalent, right? Even if we put a condition that jumps to the default, then it doesn't matter. So labeling the switch doesn't seem to be important, and whenever you use break, so you just jump out of it. So labeling for the switch is allowed, that's something that we pretty much never use. Control flow continues with the first statement of the following switch block. The break statements are necessary because without them, a statement in switch blocks fall through. All statements after the matching case label are executed in sequence regardless of the expression of the subsequent case labels, which means the first test that matches, the rest become invisible. Even the default becomes invisible, right? Until a break statement is encountered. The following code uses fall through to fill the future months list. So this is one of the use cases of fall through. I highly recommend that you don't do this. So basically what happens is that, let's say I want to test for a month, right? The index, we have 12 months, 1, 2, 3, etc. And I want to have a list that I want to test for a month, and I want to fill out this list with the names of the month from that month forward. So if it's January, I want to fill the list with all the months that come after that. Same with, let's say, April, right? So what we do, let's say we put a month here, and we don't put any break. Obviously, for the default, we break. For the last case, we also break. I mean, it's really, you don't really necessarily have to put break here. So what happens here is that if we put some number, let's say 8. So when we switch on month, which is allowed because it's an int type, we match this case, right? And then we add the August. And then the other case tests are invisible, which means we fall through because there is no break. So we add August, we add also September, October, November, December. So this is one of the use cases, for example, on switch. And the reason switch, it makes sense because the number of months is basically a limited set of possibilities. So again, that's something we can do switch on. Now, obviously, it's more conventional to use enum for the month. So you can rewrite this code to use an enum. Technically, the final break, or this one, is not required because we're not doing anything specific in the default. So remember, if you match case 8, the default will also be executed. So if you don't have that break, so we can test this, right? So let's say public static void test2, and I'm going to invoke test2, and let's paste the code that we had. Let's import the list from Java util, and I've done a color coding, and let's also import the array list. We haven't looked at the collection framework at the moment, but I want to give you a quick tip in terms of code formatting in your IDE, which makes for example, Eclipse has very nice thing is that you can color code different types. For example, my classes, I've changed the color coding so that classes are black, but the interfaces are blue. So when I look at the source code, Eclipse with this color coding, it's very easy for me that realize that list is actually a type which is an interface. It's not a class. And you can have separate color codes, for example, for abstract classes, interfaces, concrete classes. It's very nice coloring feature. I highly recommend you to take advantage of this nice visual aid that IDEs provide in terms of color coding, right? For example, strings are always blue. Raw string literals are blue, which is very nice. Local variables is brown. Keywords are basically red, which is very easy to understand that these are keywords. So if we run test2, obviously we need to print this out. So do a sysout on the future month, and this calls the toString on the array list. So August, September, October, November, December, this break is not necessary because we really don't have any line of code after that. So still works fine. If I set this to 1, for example, it's all. If I set this to 0, we only match the default. Remember, if we don't match any cases, we still match the default, right? So if we comment this out, what happens? We're not doing anything. Basically, in the past, the compiler would have given you an error saying that because right now the compiler doesn't know. So we know that logically the number of months has to have a limited set of numbers, but when you use an int, the compiler doesn't really know that how many, if there is a limited number of cases. That's why we recommend that for this kind of stuff, always use enum. That gives the compiler more clues as to what to check for, right? For example, if you use enum and then don't forget to add all the cases, the compiler gives you a compilation error saying that, okay, you didn't test all the cases. That's why, again, it's best to use the help that the compiler provides. If you ask compiler for help, or basically you give the compiler more clues about what you're trying to do. Remember, compiler is there to help you, not to torture you. Okay, so so always try to take advantage of the help that the compiler provides, and then that requires, in this case, for us to basically redefine the basically this switch to take advantage of an enum construct. But that's something that we will see in the future lectures. So this default is not necessary here, and we can still run this, and note that if I put a statement here, sysout default, we are still hitting the default, right? So even if, remember, fall through happens, even if month is 1, for example, we are still hitting the default. So don't forget that. So the break that is in the source code, this is technically not required if you don't do anything in the default, but now we're doing something in the default, so we have to have this break here, right? Just be careful about that. Yeah, so this is one of the use cases of fall through, that basically we want to test for something and also execute the other cases that come after this test, right? Yeah, the final break is not required because the flow falls out of the switch statement anyways. We're not doing anything in default. But again, if you don't put this break here, we also hit the default. The default will be executed. So if you have a extra code in the default, you have to be careful to avoid that. Using a break is recommended so that modifying the code is easier and less error prone. The default section handles all values that are not explicitly handled by one of the case sections. Now the thing here is that in this construct, remember, switch statement cannot return a value. You cannot say, for example, basically int x equals the result of the switch statement. That's why they added switch expressions. Now the problem is that you have to define your variables, whatever you want to do, outside your switch, and therefore you can't really confine. For example, this month, you cannot define, for example, int month equals 5, just like what you do in a loop, right? It's not allowed, which means this variable has to be defined outside, which means you can't really confine a variable to the scope of switch. Now let's see if we can define a local variable in the body of the switch. It's not allowed. So syntax tokens, switch labels, expect. So what this means is that you cannot really define anything out of the ordinary in the switch, but you can do that in the case statements. For example, in this case, I can say int x equals 5. It's allowed, right? Because each case has a body of statements that can be executed. But outside these cases, you cannot define some extra lines of code, statements. The variable, the parameter or argument to the switch cannot be confined as a local variable to the switch body. That's not possible. So there are some limitations. The following code example shows how a statement can have multiple case labels. The code example calculates the number of days in a particular month. Now, exactly because of this type of syntax, they decided to evolve the switch statement into switch expression, because this looks ugly, right? But before introducing the switch expressions, this was the only way. And what we're doing here, we're relying exactly on fall through, which is a relatively dangerous thing or bad practice, to rely on fall through, because it makes the code less readable. You see case 1 column, case 3 column, case 5 column, you don't understand really what's going on, right? Now with the switch, so let's run this and I'll show you how to basically rewrite this with switch statements. So let's say public static void test3. Let's copy and paste this here, and let's execute test3. All right. So what happens here? We define a month, integer, a year, and a number of days, and we switch on the month and says if the month is case 1, case 3, case, all these. But for example, case 1 doesn't have any particular body, But if case 1 matches, because we don't have the break, the rest of the cases are invisible, and then we hit this line and break. Same with case 3. If case 3 matches, the rest of the cases are invisible, and then we hit this line and break. So for all these matches, case 1, 3, 5, 7, 8, 10, 12, we hit this line, right? Wouldn't it be nicer if we could something like this? So wouldn't this be nicer if we could say case 1, comma 3, comma 5, comma 7, comma 8, comma 10, comma 12, and do something? This would have been nicer, but let's see if we can rewrite this like that. So case 1, 3, 5, 7, 8, 10, 12, do this. And now this is allowed. So that's the good syntax. Let's run this. Let's maybe print the number of days. And 28. So we are hitting this line, right? And know that we're using an if else construct even in the case. And again, anything for the body of a case, you can use any valid syntax, right? And if we set the month, for example, to 1, we get 31. Now this is allowed, and I believe this was not allowed in, for example, in Java 8, and we can test it. So if I change my runtime to Java 8, let's put it on 16 and use an alternative. Okay, so let's set the execution environment to Java 8. Now this line gives a compilation error, and let's look at the error. Multi-constant case labels supported from Java 14 onward, right? So when I said wouldn't this be nice, obviously the Java designers also thought about this and added this from Java 14. So this is not allowed in Java 8, but then because the fact that cascading these cases and relying on fall through is really weird and not nice looking, then they decided to make it nicer. So from Java 14, obviously these days Java 17 is the latest version. Right now I'm using Java 16 as my reference. So Eclipse recompiles, and then everything looks good. So let's run this again, and it works. So from Java 14, you can cascade cases in a nicer way using comma. And this means that for any of these matches, fall through happens. So you're executing the same line of codes, the same body of codes for any of these matches, which is good, right? Now, what happens if we have multiple matches? Obviously, in the case that never happens, because when I said the first match, when the first match happens, anything that comes after that becomes invisible. That's why you cannot have basically multiple matches. That doesn't happen. Instead, you have fall through, for example. So this code has one statement for more than one case, which is fine. I mean, in the body of the case, you can have multiple statements. And again, case 4, case 6, we can write it as case 4, 6, right? And 9, 11, we want all of these to have the fall through. So let me comment this out. So this code still works fine, and we can also have multiple cases with like this. So we shouldn't have column. So we can still cascade them, but there is no point. We can use the comma syntax, which is much nicer, right? And case 2, break, default, we're doing some default. Obviously, if we have 13 here, we use the invalid month because none of the cases match. We match the default and we break, okay? All right, and this was the more discussion on the switch and the new syntax that they introduced, which is the comma syntax for basically relying on the fall through, or basically executing the same body of code in the switch statement for multiple cases. If any of those matches, we want to execute the same body of code. So from Java 14, you can use this kind of comma separated case, which is a very nice feature. So I hope you enjoyed this. Please stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next one.